Hey guys, and welcome to another video. Today's deck is about Mardu humans, which did pretty well for me on the Alchemy Mythic ladder. And yeah, I think now we just go over the cards in the list. At the 1 mana slot as our only creature, technically, we have the Recruitment Officer. This is just a very solid human that sees, for example, also play in the Soldiers deck in Standard. It's just quite nice in the early game as a 2-powered creature for 1 mana, but also in the late game you get to activate its ability to look at the top 4 cards to maybe just then find just the right creature that you want for the situation, or any good creature. Of course, you would like to play more of this card, but the rest of the deck is just really stacked and I really struggle to find place for all the great cards that I wanted to include, so yeah. I still want to have 1-drops though, that's obviously pretty good in a more aggressive slanted deck. And also in Alchemy there is a card named Fragment Reality that can exile an artifact, enchantment or creature, and then you get a creature with lesser mana value from the deck. So if they would hit a 2-drop with that, if they would run that, then it's quite important slash nice of course to have the Recruitment Officer or at least any 1-drop creature in the deck. So that's another reason for Alchemy to have at least one 1-drop in there as a creature. I also was trying, by the way, the Hopeful Initiate in that spot, which is pretty nice to have like access to artifact and enchantment removal in a sense in the late game, which can be of course quite relevant against a couple of cards. For example, Reflection of the Kiki-Chiki. And then as a 4-off as a 1-drop, we have Kumano Faces Kakasan. Probably don't have to tell you too much about that card. It's just really nice, basically having 3 power in a sense, by giving the +1/+1 counter on the second stage to a creature that you cast. And giving the counter in this deck is quite relevant, but I come to that in a second. It's just Kumano, really good card. The cool thing maybe about this deck is that it is a humans deck, and Kumano, the etching of Kumano, is a human shaman, which then gets, for example, buffed by our collation construct. Then I also have 1 Strangle in here as 1 mana interaction, which of course makes sense in best of 1 when you are, for example, up against an aggressive deck like Mono Red. Obviously I went through different versions of the deck when I was playing all these games, and in one of the earlier ones I had even 3 Strangles because of that. But the thing is, Mono Red wasn't even that popular. Of course it's still a popular deck, but it's not every second match, it's like every third or so, maybe even fourth. It's best of 1, that's kind of the challenge, right? That's why I have this like package of, it's also funny because it's the Mardu colors. Like I jumped to those maybe real quick and just do the couple removals, but we only have Brutal Cathar, the Strangle, Lantern Flare and Go for the Throat as 4 ways of interaction for creatures on the board. Of course you would technically like to play more, but you cannot play more non-creature spells because of Inquisitor Captain, and you have the Kumanos already. And Kumanos is just that good of a card that I think this is justified, otherwise you would have to cut Kumanos basically, which is something you can do. I personally do not like that though that much. And then you could also argue to play maybe more Brutal Cathars. You can also do that, but I personally do not like Brutal Cathar that much because it's a 3 mana removal spell that gets removed for 1 or 2 mana, often, not always, but often, and then you get also potentially ambushed by like a Sheldred. Like, I just personally do not like Cathar, but I think the first one is really nice. But that one I also do in a second. So Go for the Throat. It's just a very universal removal spell, probably one of the best, if not the best 2 mana removal spell. Pretty just darn good for 2 mana. And then Lantern Flare is maybe interesting because this is maybe the best one later on. The issue with this is that you kind of cannot cast it on turn 2 unless you cast like a Recruitment Officer on turn 1 and they have 1 toughness creature that you actually do want to remove on turn 2 and just not play another good proactive play like a Clement or a Thalia. So it's pretty much never going to be played sooner than turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. But that's where the card is kind of shining, right? Because you get some life back. So that's pretty good versus aggressive decks, but it technically also is able to take out bigger things. Like the Strangle, as I just said, cannot do that, but Lantern Flare technically can do that. A card, for example, that is pretty great with that, of course, is Adeline, because she gives you 2 bodies for 3 mana for only 1 card. And then let's say if you have 5 mana, you can then use the Lantern Flare to maybe get the 3 or 4 damage off to take out a 3 or 4 toughness creature of the opponent. So this card I think has a lot of upside, but it has some risk with it. As I just said before, you cannot cast it early. And sometimes, I mean, the other card that you want to take out that Strangle cannot take out is pretty much like Sheldred. And Sheldred has 5 toughness. It's not too easy to get to 5 creatures. And technically, if the opponent has open mana and maybe a pause and passes to you, then you also have to be careful. You kind of then want to even have 6 creatures in play, right? Because they might just have an instant speed removal spell for 1 of your creatures, and then you would kind of fizzle that like 5th damage, so you kind of need 6. So the card comes with some risk, but I think it has enough upside to be at least a one-off. But let's continue with the 2-mana slot here. We have Clement in our humans deck. I mean, that card is just still very good. It's basically, if you drop it on turn 2, kind of like a lord for your entire hand. And then in the late game, you can also use its specialized ability. The thing with Clement in this deck also is, though, that it does not get buffed by Correlation Construct. Our lands unfortunately don't have basic types unless they're one of Plains to give the Clement a specialize. And we have such great 2-drops to play on turn 2. Trust me, I would love to go up. I started with 4, then went down to 3, and then I added the second Rahilda, and then I came to 2. But we have just such good 2-drops in Thalia and Juggernaut Peddler, the Kalane, and the Rahilda even, so it's rough. I have one Clement in the sideboard versus certain matchups, but that's where I am right now. Of course, still insanely good card in your creature deck, and I think you can definitely go to 3 if you find a card that you want to cut. I think I cannot cut any card. Thalia, of course, makes sense. In your humans deck that barely has non-creature spells. A really cool also thing about Thalia in this deck is the first strike, which I come to in a second. Another card which has the first strike is Rahilda, Wanted Cutthroat. This card is a little older when it comes to Alchemy, so probably you know it, have played against it or with it. It's a mythic first strike 2-mana 2/2 that lets you basically exile a non-land card from the opponent's library each time it connects with the opposing player, and then you can cast it as long as you have attacked with a werewolf on each of your turns, and that maybe also then works with the Brutal Cathar or another Rahilda in the late game. That's pretty unlikely, but the nice thing about this 2-drop in particular is just that if Rahilda does not get answered, she kind of can run away with the game with like card advantage, which is something you in particular do not have with the other cards, or in particular the other 2-drops, which is good. Like, you want creatures that enter the battlefield that do already a thing because of like interaction, like the Peddler is very good for that, the Clement of course, Thalia can tax right away, Kalane at least gives the treasure. So Rahilda is like that kind of only thing that is vulnerable to it, but the upside of course is that it has a really strong effect attached to it, and I think you want to at least sprinkle 1, or in this case 2 cards like this to have a healthy, strong mix. And yeah, as I said, it can just kind of run away with the game with card advantage, especially if it transforms into the Feral Outlaw. Maybe it probably has happened to you as well. The opponent does pass to you, does not realize you have a Thy Night card on the battlefield, and then you just get to have that. Otherwise, the deck is, of course, not as good in getting to nighttime by itself, but that's just something to keep in mind, and of course, pretty neat to have. Then the reason why the first strike on those 2 cards is pretty good. By the way, also the Brutal Cathar that can transform into the Moonrage Brute has that first strike, which is relevant for the Juggernaut Peddler. So Peddler, when it enters the battlefield, basically allows you to look at the opponent's non-land cards, and then you get to pick one, get to exile it, and they then get to conjure a card named Juggernaut into their hand. Like, Juggernaut is like an older card, and the thing is, Alchemy is a very strong format, and the 4-mana 5/3 that has to attack each combat is just really bad, I think, in the format in general, especially, of course, if you have powered up first strike creatures like Rahilda and Thalia. Like, you have so many ways to buff them, and the Moonrage Brute of course has 3 power on base already. So often you just have this scenario where they are forced to attack with the Juggernaut because that's its ability. And then if they don't have immediate removal for one of your first strike creatures, then you can just snipe it off with one of those, which is just something neat to keep in mind. But even if not, the card is just really bad. It gets just eaten by the Peddler, which is buffed up often. So yeah, Juggernaut just pretty bad, and therefore I'm very high on the Peddler. I would even, I think, play it as a 2-mana 2/1 without any additional text, but it has 2 toughness and also vigilance. So I think the card is very good and definitely a quite huge incentive for the deck. Even if you think the Juggernaut being able to block right away is a downside, I don't think that is that much of a big deal, but obviously something to keep in mind. When it drops, then it can still block. And also something maybe that is really nice about cards like this, that you get information about the opponent's hand, which I think is very good as well. Like, so often, I'm not sure if you had the situation or if you can remember it, but so often I was in the spot where I was like, I need to know the opponent's hand now to make the proper play. Like, I need to know if it's a counterspell, I need to know what's going on in order to make my right decision here. It just completely shapes the way of how I'm playing my cards, and is just sometimes totally game losing or game winning. So the information about the opponent's cards is, I think, very good as well as soon as turn 2. Okay, and then as the last 2-drop, this could maybe also be like kind of a 1-drop. because Kalain Reclusive Painter has the ability to create a treasure token when she enters the battlefield, and then whenever you cast a creature with one of your treasures, basically for each treasure spent to cast that card, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter for each of those treasures. So that on base is already pretty decent, because it's kind of a 1-mana card that gives a +1/+1 counter to another creature. Reminds of maybe like on the pup from the like green decks, because that's also a 1/2, but of course the pup also gives trample, or reminds maybe a little bit of Kumano, but Kumano of course in that sense is also better. The upside with Kalain of course is Crucius Titan of Waves, because Crucius makes a lot of treasures, and then you can pump all these treasures into your creatures and buff them up. So that's, I think, a pretty cool thing about Kalain. And also she can ramp into your strong 4-drop Inquisitor Captain and just have a Captain on turn 3, which I think is not quite fair. So I think Kalain is definitely worth a try if you play a deck like this. She's only a uncommon, and I think you can play a third Clement over it, but I'm quite happy with Kalain because of the just named reasons. It's also always nice to have like more of a spread with your legendaries. And yeah, the treasure, by the way, can also help like for mana fixing if you miss a color. In particular with Adeline, this can be nice because you have barely 18 white for her, and yeah, just pretty cool to have this card on turn 2 or later in the game. Like here I also have a scene where you cast the Inquisitor Captain, hit the Kalain, and then that allows you, only that allows you to play another powerful card with the extra mana, of course then buffed by quite a bit. And then let's continue with the 3-mana spot. Here I have Anointed Peacekeeper. I think the card is like pretty silly, like I just said, being also able to look at the opponent's hand is really nice, but then just to tax their best card for 2 additional mana, and therefore it probably not being able to be cast in the soon time where it would be relevant, right? Because it's their next best thing that you usually are choosing, makes the card just, I mean, it's a silly card. It's very good. And it also just has Vigilance on top. Like, why do they have that? It's just so good. Adeline, of course, makes a lot of sense. It's a very good card, in particular nice with the Lantern Flare, and it's just Adeline. Obviously, you play her in your humans deck, and notably works with the Coalition construct, like the tokens produced by her are humans, and it does not care about it being tokens or not. And then I have the 1 copy of Brutal Cathar, but I just mentioned that, which is of course quite nice to hit with Inquisitor Captain. I think the first copy is quite nice, but the other additional copies, in my personal opinion, that I just stated before, is not so good. But that's just me. I think you maybe want to play more Cathars in your creature tribal human deck. I personally do not like that card. And then you have Older Ravenguard, the Marshal. I think this is a really cool card in each creature deck that plays those colors, because Alchemy as it is right now is like often really a very grindy format, like of course less in best of 1, and this video is about best of 1, but even there I saw so many people playing other decks than Mono Red, which of course then are like often, not always, but often less aggressive, and then therefore more mid-rangey or even like control. Being able to just kind of draw a card each turn, it's just I think really nice being attached to your 3-mana 3-drop. So Older basically, when it enters the battlefield, gives one of your creatures double team, and then each time it attacks, you can then choose one of your other attacking creatures, and then you get to conjure a duplicate of that creature into your hand, which I think is really good. It might not seem too big of a deal, but drawing a card each turn I think is pretty nasty, especially if it's like a certain card that you want, like maybe the Brutal Cathar, maybe a construct. In particular, the Inquisitor Captain is probably pretty nice to then target, because you do not mind it losing in combat and attacking with it. Like you can pretty much always attack with the captain, especially if it's buffed, and then just getting another one, just keep getting more card advantage. Like it's, I think, just nice to have some of these card advantage spells in there in the deck that is often just focusing on, like, you know, like hate and being able to answer their stuff. You have a couple of removal spells. So I think these card advantage effects are really nice in a deck like this, and also the buff effects. Like you have the Kumanos, the Kalain, the Clements, but of course also Coalition Construct. This is like one of the few tribal payoffs in Alchemy that you have access to. In this case in creature form at a 3-mana spot. So Coalition Construct I just featured in the last creature tribal deck with the goblins. So of course this makes a ton of sense in this deck as well, especially if you hit it with Inquisitor Captain, being able to not only pump the captain but your entire team and also all the humans in hand. Again, also here notably, if you cast a construct and there's another 1 or 2 additional constructs in hand, it does not count for those in hand because those are not yet humans, but it becomes a human when it enters the battlefield. Unless you want to maybe go for like clerics, maybe have like a Clement in play, notably the Inquisitor Captain is also a cleric, same as the like Anointed Peacekeeper, and you have some sideboard stuff. But most of the time it's gonna be, of course, humans. I have some cases where I specialized Clement for black, and then I had like the creature type that was most prevalent at my side of the battlefield was zombie, so I was just going for zombie, and then I like top decked, I think, even another construct, which I was then not able to cast because the opponent scooped. But so it's a flexible thing sometimes when it comes to the naming, but most of the time it's going to be pretty obvious what you're going to choose. Yeah, and then last but not least, of course, at the 4-mana spot, we have the Inquisitor Captain, one of the big payoffs for creature decks in general, but in particular humans, because it is a human cleric with also vigilance. Why does it also have vigilance? You would just easily be able to play it without vigilance, but it also has that. So that's of course really nice, because I think vigilance is a pretty good ability that might be underrated. Especially if you're up against like more aggressive decks, being able to attack and block is just so valuable. Yeah, this basically has some sort of cascade effect attached to it. I talked about it also already in one of the past videos, like especially like the Band Vexer Seek deck. Like you get to pick 2 random CMC3 or less creatures from your library, and then you get to choose one of them and get to put it into play for free, which of course is a super strong mana efficient card advantage ability that is attached to it, and yeah, maybe allows you to get one of the following sideboard cards. That's one reason, like in general, because it's a creature deck, but that's one reason why we have so many creatures in the sideboard. Starting from above, maybe I have another Clement and the Swarm Saboteur in particular, in cases I want to take out Thalia, right? Because sometimes you're up against like more creature-based strategies like the Naya Cabaret Rebels life gain deck. Of course it has Rebels, but it's mostly just creatures and you don't want to play Thalia, you want to play then like interaction. By the way, yeah, this video is about best of 1, but I'm just going over the sideboard cards because I think you can definitely play this version also in best of 3. That's the reason why I'm going over these right now, but this is just built for best of 1, but I think you can also play it in best of 3. In best of 3 I would just not play the Lantern Flare probably, and also not the Strangle. I would just play 3, go for the Throats. I think that's one of the only, if not the only change I would make. And then the cute thing about Saboteur maybe also is that it is pretty decent versus like Raffine decks, right? Because they often have like 4 toughness. Let's say they go Danik into Raffine. You usually cannot block that. I have this done in other decks in the past in standard versions, but Raffine is also prevalent in best of 3, I think. And another insane card to bring against that deck being Esper Avernus Reanimator basically, is that, I also just mentioned this in the last video about goblins, is Elish Norn, because really most creatures in the deck have enters the battlefield abilities, and you can just really almost shut down their entire deck by playing Elish Norn as soon as turn 4, thanks to Crucius and Kalain. And I also tried Elish Norn, by the way, in this deck, in the main deck, because if you look at our deck, we actually have so many EDB effects of our own with our creatures, so being able to double them with Elish Norn is just a great payoff for our deck as well, which of course is one of her abilities. And in particular, if you just go Elish Norn into Inquisitor Captain, like things just get wild, right? Because you get 2 triggers of the Captain, then you hit another thing with maybe 2 triggers, then you hit another thing with maybe 2 triggers. So Elish Norn can just be pretty wild by just being a proactive play in this deck, and that's why I tested her in the main deck when I was playing best of 3 in particular. In best of 1 I think the card's a little bit too slow, and yeah, it does not have too many targets, I think, when it comes to opposing decks, where her like hate effect is relevant, I think. And then another great card that would also benefit from Elish Norn, of course, is Extraction Specialist in the sideboard. You could totally also main deck this. I really am in love with this card. I think it's a very strong effect to basically have also like this sort of cascade thing going on. You have a couple of targets that you don't really mind if they cannot attack or block, like the Peddler, Clement, Kalain and stuff like that. Even Thalia can be pretty decent. And you have other cards in the sideboard like the Dawnbringer Cleric that you really like to bring in play. For example, against Mono Red. Against Mono Red, the lifelink is pretty relevant. That's definitely a card I would consider bringing each time after sideboarding, whether it is game 1 or game 2. So yeah, I think this card is very nice, and also, for example, against like mid-range decks, of course, that have a lot of interaction. Like, because one of the downsides with cards like Extraction Specialist is that you cannot always like cast it profitably on turn 3, right? Because you don't always have something in the graveyard on turn 2, but against like very interactive decks, it makes, of course, sense to then still bring it. And I also have the Eternal Escort in there, also for like very aggressive decks, of course, like Mono Red. Yeah, just giving a creature in your hand lifelink I think is very good, and of course if they don't have an answer for it, not only does it raise them for attacking for 3 lifelink each turn, but it also just keeps repeating that effect by giving one of your creatures lifelink, or like even a Strangle lifelink sometimes maybe. And the Kumano I think would also then work with the ping. I don't know, I'm not sure about that, but it does work for burn spells. Another card, of course, that can have an effect like that is the Clement by just pitching a white card to the live Acolyte, which is often just so nice against the red deck. In particular, by the way, also if they use Traumatic Prank on one of your creatures, just that creature having lifelink then also offsets the 1 ping to your face on each of your upkeeps, by the way, which is just, of course, nice to have access then to as well. And then at the last card and the like proactive stuff, this is like more reactive, this is like more proactive. I'll always try to have like some sort of theme when I separate those two piles, like creatures and non-creatures or something like that, but of course you don't have to do that. So Avernus is just a really insane card to play in the late game, especially when you're up against also more interactive opponents that use a ton of removal against your creatures. So that's definitely a matchup where I would consider bringing Ascent from Avernus against. I also, of course, would like to main deck that card, but as I mentioned before, it's just really rough to bring in any non-creature card into the deck. But it's definitely also a consideration for it being main deck because the card is just very silly. You probably already also know it. And then next up I have Dawnbringer Cleric at a 2-mana creature spot. Of course, this is a human. This card I would in particular bring versus mono red. Being able to gain the 2 life is just always nice. The 1/3 body is pretty decent because quite often the creatures have only 1 toughness. Even if they have more power, it can still trade or even like threaten to profitably block it. But then you also have the option for destroying like an enchantment, like for example Kumano faces Kakasan, or exile a card from the graveyard like a Squeeze. So I would definitely bring this versus mono red to just not lose on the draw too fast by gaining the life or maybe interacting with one of their Kumanos or a card in the graveyard like Phoenix Chick or the Squee. And yeah, then you have also the Hearse, of course, versus graveyard decks. An additional Brutal Cathar, as I said before, is pretty neat with the Inquisitor Captain in general. So yeah, even if I said before I'm not too big of a fan, but being able to hit it off Inquisitor Captain in particular is just really nice. And it's just being a removal spell that you can bring because it's a creature is just obviously a thing you want to have in general access to in your sideboard. And then another cool removal spell in creature form, of course, is Lauren. Being able to interact with decks that run good artifacts and or enchantments, especially decks that really evolve around like an artifact or enchantment, like the, for example, just mentioned Kaba-Ready Revels deck. But also, for example, like Vat Atraxa is something you very want to consider bringing a Lauren for the Unequaled Anvil. Trespasser is pretty nice versus like more mid-range deck because of its Ward discard a card effect, and of course the like drain effect is pretty good to not lose against each deck. Like each deck can pressure you and your life total, but also versus like aggressive decks you can consider bringing it for example also mono red, because often they really want to just point a 2-mana removal spell or a prank at one of your creatures, and that's not too easy if they have then to also pay the discard a card effect on it. And it's just being able to drain on EDB and each time it attacks is pretty nice versus that deck as well. And of course in general you also have the option of it being able to transform into the Graveyard Glutton, and then that drain effect not only doubles, but it also gets an additional +1/+1 on base power and toughness basically. And of course you have still this like Rahilda thing going on, and like you also get nighttime in general, which can be cool for also Brutal Cathar, but Rahilda in particular then also has another card which can enable her cards that she has exiled from the opponent to then being able to cast them. And then you also have Night Clubber versus also Anvil and mono red, which are just prevalent decks, and you just have to put the cards in the sideboard that actually do something nice in human creature forms versus other relevant decks. And yeah, this just being able to give -1/-1 to creatures can be relevant against those two decks. Clicked on a cleric there before, obviously. This is 15 cards in the sideboard. And yeah, then maybe the mana real quick. It's pretty good, I think. Obviously also thanks to Secluded Courtyard. For that, of course, it does not cast Kumano on turn 1, but that's why we have probably still enough red for it, and having 16 red plus the courtyards and then technically 16 black. But you also have to like always like count at least -1 for that, because often you have to play the Crossroads on another color on turn 1 or turn 2, so technically more like 15, but that's still plenty. You only need 13 for your black 2-drop, and you don't have to cast them, of course, but yeah, it should still be enough. And then, as I said before, 18 white for just being able to cast Adeline. But remember you also have to like Kalane Treasure and of course Crucius Treasures. And yep, that's pretty much the deck. I think now it's time for some games. remember, of course, after each game that I played, I come back to this and think about things that I can change, think about things that I can optimize. I play like 30, 40 games with a deck and each time come back trying to change something. So as I mentioned before in the beginning, I also have like multiple Strangles, I have multiple Go for the Throats sometimes. This is just the final version here, but the other versions are very similar to this, which of course is true for most of, if not all of, the past and the future videos that I'm doing. Talking about future video, by the way, I also do a humans deck. I think for the next one I already have played some games, and I think I also finished the version pretty much with Cheska humans, which is pretty cool because of one card in particular that you will see soon. And yeah, maybe one last thing, you have some legendary lands in there, of course, which is pretty neat in the deck because you have quite some legendaries. Almost forgot to say that. But yeah, if you like creature decks, if you like tribal and maybe even humans decks, I wish you some fun with watching some of the games now. Let's hop into them and see you next time, guys. Ciao, ciao.
won't stop fighting till the people are safe again. You're lucky this is a warning shot. Listen, jerk! Move it! Give a toast? I'd love to. Aw, you're looking a little singed.